Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are doing something a little bit different. Usually, we look at a specific event or, a modern trend, something ripped from the headlines. But today, we're essentially sitting down with a time traveler.
That is a very evocative way to put it, and honestly, it's not really an exaggeration.
It feels true, doesn't it? I mean, we are looking at a man who walked around the United States in the 1830s.
Yeah.
We're talking about a world of muddy roads, stagecoaches, steamboats, the very, very early frontier, a world where the telegraph was barely even an idea.
Right. A completely different planet in some ways.
And yet, when you read his work today, here in the 2020s, it feels like he's scrolling through a Twitter feed or watching the evening news. It's uncanny.
It is.
He predicted the Cold War. He predicted the specific kind of isolation and anxiety we feel in modern life. He even, and this is the really spooky part, predicted the rise of a soft kind of tyranny that looks suspiciously like the algorithm-driven, convenience-obsessed world we live in now.
He absolutely did. He saw the seeds of our future in the soil of the 1830s. We are, of course, talking about Alexis de Tocqueville.
The French aristocrat who came to America and wrote basically the ultimate book on it, Democracy in America.
Exactly. And while he is often cited, usually by politicians who want to sound smart, or pundits who pull a single quote out of context to prove some point, the reality of who he was and what he actually saw is so much more complex and so much more interesting.
So that's our mission today. To unpack how this man, who came from a family that was nearly wiped out by the guillotine in France, became the ultimate explainer of democratic liberty.
But not just the good stuff.
No, we aren't just doing the highlight reel, right? We're going to get into the messy stuff, too.
We have to. Because the same man who wrote so eloquently about liberty also held some very dark, often overlooked, and contradictory views on colonialism and race.
Okay, so we're looking at his biography, his major works like Democracy in America, The Old Regime, and the Revolution, and also his travel writings on places like Algeria and Ireland.
It's a massive stack of sources today. We've got the biography, the letters, the travel journals.
So, tone setter for you, the listener. Imagine a guy looking at the chaos of Jacksonian America. I mean, the rough manners, the constant elections, tobacco spitting, and somehow seeing the future of the entire world.
And importantly, he wasn't just an observer. He wasn't just, a tourist taking notes for the fun of it. He was a man on a mission. He was trying to save France. He was looking for a way to stop his own country from making the same bloody mistakes it had made in the past.
Okay, let's unpack this. Section 1, the aristocrat who sailed west. And we really have to start with where he came from because his family background, it sounds absolutely terrifying.
It was traumatic, to say the least. Alexis de Tocqueville was born on July 29th, 1805 in Paris into an old aristocratic Norman family. But to understand his psyche, his whole mindset, you have to look at the generation just before him. He was the great-grandson of the statesman Malesherbes.
And for those who aren't up on their French Revolution history, Malesherbes, he did not have a happy ending.
No. He was a defender of King Louis XVI. And for that loyalty, he was guillotined in 1794.
Wow.
And it wasn't just him. Tocqueville's own parents, Herve and Louise, they were imprisoned during the Terror, the bloodiest, most paranoid phase of the French Revolution. They were on the list, scheduled to be executed.
So they were on death row, basically.
They were. They were in prison watching their friends and family members being taken away to the guillotine, day after day, knowing their turn was coming.
Talk about a close call. I mean, how did they survive?
Pure luck. They only escaped the guillotine because the man in charge, Maximilien Robespierre, he fell from power in 1794.
Ah, okay.
Robespierre was overthrown and executed himself just days before Tocqueville's parents were scheduled to die. So they survived, but the trauma it never left them.
And that must have completely shaped Tocqueville's childhood.
Completely. He grew up in a world that felt incredibly fragile. He heard these stories constantly. There's this one famous detail that his father's hair turned pure white overnight in prison from the stress.
White hair. How old was he?
He was only 24 years old at the time.
That is an incredibly vivid image. White hair at 24.
Yeah.
So when Tocqueville looks at the people or the mob later in his life, he's not just thinking about voters or, demographic statistics. He's thinking about the force that almost annihilated his entire family.
Precisely. It gave him this profound sense of the fragility of liberty. He realized that democracy wasn't just a political system, it was a tidal wave. It was this force of nature that could so easily turn into tyranny if it wasn't handled with extreme care.
So he wasn't a Democrat by nature.
Not at all. He was an aristocrat by birth who was smart enough to realize that aristocracy was dead, and he needed to understand what was coming next.
Okay, so fast forward to 1831. He's a young man, about 25 years old. He's working as a lawyer, a magistrate. But the political situation in France is messy again.
It's always messy. The July monarchy has just taken over, and he's not a fan. He felt trapped. He wanted to get away, to see something new, and maybe just let the political dust settle back home. So he and his lifelong friend, Gustave de Beaumont, they came up with a plan.
But they couldn't just say, hey, we're going on a gap year to find ourselves, right?
Right.
They needed a reason.
No, they needed an official reason to get a leave of absence and, more importantly, government approval. So they pitched a mission to the French government. They would go to the United States to examine its prisons and penitentiaries.
A prison tour. That was the cover story.
It sounds kind of dull to us now, but at the time, it was a very legitimate cover. Prison reform was a huge debate in Europe. The Enlightenment had changed how people thought about punishment. It wasn't just about dungeons and torture anymore. The new idea was about rehabilitation.
And the U.S. was the laboratory for this stuff.
It was experimenting with brand new systems, and France wanted to know if they should copy them. So it was the perfect excuse.
So off they went. They landed in 1831. Can we just pause for a second on that trip? I want to understand the logistics. This wasn't a quick flight. What was the crossing like?
The crossing was brutal. They sailed on a ship called the Havre. It took 37 days.
37 days.
And they ran into storms that were so bad, Tocqueville, being the kind of curious intellectual he was, actually tied himself to the mast at one point just to watch the waves. He was sick. He was exhausted.
That really sets the scene. And what about New York when they finally got there?
New York in 1831 wasn't the metropolis we know. It was a boomtown for sure, but there were pigs literally roaming the streets. It was chaotic. But what struck him immediately was the energy. He wrote home saying, "I have never seen a people so full of life."
And on the prison focus, why prisons? What specifically were they looking at that was so new?
The Americans had two rival systems that the whole world was watching, the Auburn system and the Philadelphia system. The Philadelphia system was total solitary confinement, 24/7. You sat in a cell, you had a Bible, and you worked alone. The idea was penitence. Silence and isolation would cure you.
That sounds like psychological torture.
Oh, it was. It drove men insane. Tocqueville interviewed prisoners who were just begging for death or any kind of human contact.
And the other one, the Auburn system.
That was in New York.
Yeah.
There, prisoners worked together during the day in large workshops and factories, but under a rule of total silence.
So you're working next to hundreds of other people hammering away, but if you even whisper, you get whipped.
Exactly. Communal work, but absolute silence. Tocqueville favored the Auburn system, but only slightly. He was pretty skeptical of both. He saw that while the bodies were being disciplined, the souls weren't necessarily being cured. But this focus on structure, on how institutions shape human behavior, that's the warm-up act for democracy in America.
Right. And while they did visit the prisons and they actually wrote the report, it's called the penitentiary system in the United States.
Yeah.
They did so much more. The itinerary for this trip is just incredible. They were everywhere.
Yeah, they didn't just hang out in Boston and New York. They traveled widely and under really difficult conditions.
You went to the East Coast cities, obviously.
Of course. But then they went out to the frontier, which at that time was Michigan.
Which is just wild to think about. Michigan as the Wild West.
It was. It was heavy wilderness. They had to hire Native American guides. They were fighting off swarms of mosquitoes. They met other Native Americans in the forests of Saginaw. It was a real adventure.
And from there?
They took steamboats down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers all the way to New Orleans.
That steamboat journey must have been incredible. I mean, the mix of people on those boats, you'd have rich planters, poor farmers, slaves, immigrants, con men.
It was a perfect microcosm of American society. And it was dangerous, too. Steamboats blew up all the time.
And after New Orleans?
They took stagecoaches through the muddy, terrible roads of the South, back toward the East Coast, and they even made a side trip up to Quebec in Canada.
And the whole time, Tocqueville is just taking notes, furiously.
Constantly. Extensive notes. He's interviewing everyone he can. He's talking to former presidents like John Quincy Adams, but he's also talking to shopkeepers, lawyers, farmers, even people in the street.
So he returned to France after 9 months, and the result wasn't just the prison report.
No. Beaumont, his friend, wrote a book called Marie, or Slavery in the United States, which was a novel focused on the racial caste system. But Tocqueville wrote the masterpiece.
Democracy in America. published in 2 volumes, the first in 1835, the second in 1840.
And it was an instant classic, because he somehow managed to explain America to Europeans better than Americans could explain it to themselves.
So let's get into section 2 here. Let's decode democracy in America. What was the big aha moment for him? Why was America so different from Europe?
He saw that Europe was trapped. It was stuck in this fading but still powerful aristocracy where your social class determined everything. But America was consumed by what he called middling values.
Middling sounds like an insult to our ears, like mediocre. But he didn't necessarily mean it that way, did he?
Not entirely, though he definitely had mixed feelings about it. What he meant was the middle class. The ethos of the middle class was everywhere. And he was especially fascinated by the work ethic.
How so?
Well, in Europe, especially among the upper class, having to work for money was seen as crass. It was vulgar. You had land, you had a title, you didn't labor for a living.
Right. It's that old idea that a gentleman doesn't get his hands dirty. It's like on Downton Abbey where they look down on the cousin who actually has a job in the city.
Exactly that. But in America, Tocqueville saw that labor was honorable. Even the wealthy worked. In fact, the prejudice was the other way around. If you were idle in America, you were the outcast. You were viewed with suspicion.
And he traced this whole dynamic back to something really specific: inheritance laws. This is one of those details in the book that sounds so boring, like legal code stuff, but he argues it's the key to the entire American character.
It is absolutely fundamental to his argument. In Europe, they had laws of primogeniture.
Primogeniture.
It means the eldest son inherits the entire estate. The land, the castle, the money, it all stays intact. This keeps the family wealth concentrated for centuries and creates a permanent aristocracy that doesn't need to work.
But America had gotten rid of that.
Right. In America, estates were split among all the children's sons and daughters. Tocqueville observed that this system broke up large fortunes within a single generation or two.
So if you have a massive farm and 5 kids, suddenly you have 5 medium farms. And the next generation, you have 25 small farms.
Exactly. It forced every generation to get back to work. It created this constant churn of wealth. The rich could become poor, and the poor could, in theory, become rich. At the very least, the rich couldn't just sit on their inherited laurels.
It creates that hustle culture, that feeling that you can't stop swimming or you'll sink.
Precisely. And this leads to another one of his key observations, this middling concept. In France, if you were born a peasant, you were a peasant. You knew your place. You weren't stressed about making it because, well, you couldn't make it. The system was fixed. But in America, Tocqueville saw a universal anxiety. He called it restlessness.
The restless spirit. I remember that phrase.
He said Americans are grave and almost sad, even in their pleasures.
Wait, sad in their pleasures? Why would they be sad while having fun?
Because they're always worried they're missing out on something better. He describes them building a house, but before the roof is even on, they sell it to move west for a better opportunity. They plant a field, but they leave before the harvest. They're constantly chasing the next best thing.
He predicted FOMO, fear of missing out.
He literally did. That's a perfect description. He saw that when everyone is theoretically equal, when the barriers to success are removed, it means that if you fail, it's your fault.
Oh, that hits hard. In an aristocracy, if I'm poor, it's because the system is rigged against me. In a democracy, if I'm poor, it's because I'm a loser.
Exactly. And that psychological burden creates a constant low-level hum of anxiety. He wrote, "He who has set his heart exclusively upon the pursuit of worldly welfare is always in a hurry, for he has but a limited time at his disposal to reach, to grasp, and to enjoy it."
That is just profound. It's the treadmill of happiness.
Yeah.
And it links directly back to that other core idea, the tension between equality and liberty.
Yes.
I think most people today in democratic societies, we think those two things are best friends. They go hand in hand. But Tocqueville said, not so fast.
This is his most famous and maybe his most important tension. He argued that while Americans love liberty, they are absolutely obsessed with equality. For them, equality is the dominant passion.
He used a really strong phrase for it, didn't he? A depraved taste.
He did. He warned of depraved taste for equality. By that, he meant a danger that the weak will want to drag the strong down to their level rather than rise up themselves.
A tall poppy syndrome.
Exactly. He feared that people would eventually prefer equality and servitude to inequality and freedom.
Wow, let's unpack that. He's saying we'd rather everyone be miserable together, as long as we're equal, than see someone else succeed more than us.
In his darker moments, yes, that was his fear. But I want to clarify something here because this often gets misquoted. You'll see memes on the internet saying Americans are so enamored of equality. The actual text is more nuanced. He's analyzing the human heart in democratic ages, not just Americans.
Oh, okay.
He says this passion for equality is ardent, insatiable, incessant, and invincible.
Invincible, that's a strong word.
A very strong word. He says people will endure poverty, enslavement, barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy. Equality is the one thing they will not give up.
This brings us to another word he basically redefined for the modern world: individualism.
Yes. Today, when we say individualism, we usually mean it's a good thing. Being unique, expressing yourself, being a maverick, you know.
Right. Wearing a crazy hat, doing your own thing, starting a company in your garage.
Exactly. But for Tocqueville, individualism was a very dangerous thing. He defined it as a calm and considered feeling that disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows.
So it's not about being unique, it's about withdrawal.
It is 100% about withdrawal. It's the citizen who says, you know what, I'm just going to focus on my family, my close friends, my business, and I'm going to leave the greater society to look after itself. He retreats into his own small private circle.
That sounds, well, it sounds like most people I know. The whole "I just want to grill for God's sakes" meme.
And that's why Tocqueville is so relevant. He saw this happening in the 1830s, and he warned that this individualism dries up the wellspring of public virtue. It eventually just merges into plain old egoism.
And if everyone withdraws into their private bubble, who is watching the state? Who is taking care of the community?
Exactly. It creates a vacuum, and a vacuum that tyranny is more than happy to fill.
So what was the cure? Did he have a solution, or was he just doom scrolling through the 19th century?
He did have a solution, and it was something he marveled at in America. The cure was associations.
Associations. You mean like clubs and groups?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was just amazed at how Americans formed associations for everything. Religious groups, temperance societies, political clubs, commercial groups, literary circles, volunteer fire departments. You name it, they had a committee for it.
He has that great quote where he says Americans of all ages, all conditions, all dispositions are constantly forming associations.
Yes. He saw that by working together in these voluntary groups, Americans overcame that selfish, individualistic withdrawal. These associations forced them to pay attention to the wider world and to the needs of their neighbors. He called it self-interest properly understood.
Self-interest properly understood. That's a key phrase. What does that mean exactly?
It means realizing that helping the community actually helps me in the long run. It's not pure selfless altruism. It's a kind of smart selfishness. By all of us chipping in to build a road, we all get to use the road. By forming a club, we all get stronger and have more influence than we would alone.
So the Rotary Club saves democracy.
In Tocqueville's view, yes. Absolutely, because it forces you to interact with your neighbors and solve problems together without waiting for the government to come in and do it for you. It builds social fabric.
It builds trust.
Okay, so that's the social state.
Yeah.
But now we have to turn to the dark side. Section 3, the dark side of democracy. Because he didn't just see happy clubs and busy workers. He saw new forms of tyranny that were totally different from the old kings and emperors.
This is where he really puts on his prophet hat. And he starts with the tyranny of the majority.
And to be clear, he's not just talking about the majority winning an election and passing laws the minority doesn't like.
No, it's much deeper and more insidious than that. He's talking about thought control. In the old days, under a king or the Inquisition, they might burn your books or throw you in a dungeon. But your mind, your soul, was still free to hate the king.
Right. You could be a martyr for your beliefs. But in a democracy, the majority possesses a power that is both physical and moral. It doesn't just coerce your body, it persuades your soul. And he used this powerful metaphor of a fence.
A formidable fence, he called it.
He says the majority has enclosed thought within a formidable fence. A rider is free inside that area, but woe to the man who goes beyond it.
And what happens if you step outside the fence? You don't go to jail, right?
No, and that's the brilliance of his observation. You don't face an inquisition. You aren't tortured. Instead, you face all kinds of unpleasantness and everyday persecution.
You go canceled.
It is the 19th century version of getting canceled, 100%. He says a career in politics is closed to you forever because you offended the only power that holds the keys. He says of the dissenter, he yields, he bends, and finally he completely withdraws into silence.
And this kind of pressure, it promotes mediocrity.
Yes. He believed this culture of majority rule stifles genius. He thought that people with superior intellect see that the public doesn't want to hear hard truths or complex ideas that challenge the comfortable majority opinion. So what do? They either hide away in small intellectual circles, or they go into business to make money, leaving politics to the people who are willing to flatter the majority.
That explains a lot about modern politics, frankly. Let's look at that specific quote you mentioned to me earlier because it's so shocking. I know of no country in which there is so little independence of mind and real freedom of discussion as in America.
That was a bombshell thing to say about the land of the free, even then.
How did he justify such a strong statement?
He justified it by looking at the press and public opinion. In France at the time, you had different factions. You had royalists, republicans, Bonapartists. They all had their own newspapers. They hated each other, but they argued. There was a clash of ideas.
Right.
In America, he saw more of a mass opinion. Once the majority decided something, say religion is good or democracy is the best system, it became taboo to seriously question it. It became a kind of secular dogma.
And this connects to his other terrifying vision, soft despotism. I want to drill down on this because this is the part of the book that feels like it was written last week. It's like a horror movie screenplay.
It is a truly chilling vision. He argues that the despotism of the future wouldn't look like the Roman emperors. It wouldn't be violent or cruel in the traditional sense. It would be soft, it would be mild and paternalistic.
Paint the picture for us. What does soft despotism look like, according to him?
He envisions a future with a multitude of men, all equal and alike, constantly circling around in pursuit of petty and paltry pleasures. They are focused entirely on themselves, their families, and their immediate material comfort.
And what's above them?
Above them stands an immense protective power, the state. But it's not a mean, oppressive state. It's a state that wants to keep them happy. It provides for their security. It supplies their necessities. It facilitates their pleasures. It directs their industries.
It sounds like a parent, the helicopter parent.
That is the exact metaphor he uses. He says the state becomes like a parent, but with one terrible difference. A parent prepares a child for adulthood. This power, he says, seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood.
Perpetual children.
Yes. It doesn't break their will. It softens it. It bends it. It guides it. It rarely forces men to act, but it constantly opposes their acting. It doesn't tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd.
That is just terrifyingly accurate to how we discuss the welfare state or even just consumerist apathy today. The idea of swapping real freedom for comfort and security.
It's the grand trade-off. We ask the government to solve every problem, to smooth every rough edge of life, and in exchange we give up our agency, our autonomy. We stop being citizens, and we start being clients or dependents.
And he saw this possibility in the 1830s when the federal government was absolutely tiny. It had, what, a few thousand employees?
That's the genius of his extrapolation. He saw the internal logic of equality and where it could lead if it was left unchecked. He saw that if everyone is equal, and therefore individually weak, they will naturally look to the one big power, the state, to protect them and provide for them.
Speaking of predictions, let's move to Section 4, the profit of geopolitics and race. Because if soft despotism wasn't enough, he also basically predicted the Cold War.
This is one of those passages that just makes you check the publication date to make sure it's real. It's at the very end of the first volume of Democracy in America. He looks at the global map of his time.
And he sees two giant players emerging from the pack.
He does. He says there are now two great nations in the world, which, starting from different points, seem to be advancing toward the same goal: the Russians and the Anglo-Americans.
And he contrasts their methods perfectly.
It's incredible. He says the American struggles against the obstacles of nature. The adversaries of the Russian are men. The American combats the wilderness and barbarism. The Russian, civilization with all its arms. The American relies on personal interest and allows the force and reason of individuals to act. The Russian concentrates all the power of society in one man. One has liberty for its principal means of action, the other servitude.
And then the kicker, the final line.
Their starting point is different and their courses are not the same. Yet each of them seems called by some secret design of providence one day to hold in its hands the destinies of half the world.
Written in 1835, over 100 years before the Cold War really kicked off. That is just spooky.
It's geopolitical foresight of the absolute highest order. He understood that mass, scale, and resources would define the future, and that the old, fragmented powers of Europe, like France and Britain, were on their way out.
But he also looked inward at the racial dynamics inside America, and this is where his picture gets very, very bleak. He didn't buy into the optimistic idea that everything would just work itself out.
Not at all. He devoted a massive chapter, the longest in the entire book, to the three races in America: the white, the Negro, and the Indian. And he saw nothing but inevitable conflict.
Let's start with his view on slavery and Black Americans. He hated slavery, right? He was an abolitionist.
He was a staunch abolitionist. He believed slavery was a profound evil, not just for the enslaved, but also for the enslaver. But he was incredibly pessimistic about what would happen after slavery ended.
And he noticed something really weird, something counterintuitive about prejudice in the North versus the South.
He did. He wrote that racial prejudice was actually stronger in the northern states that had abolished slavery than in the southern states where it still existed.
How did he explain that? That seems completely backwards.
His logic was that in the South, slavery was a legal institution. It was a fixed hierarchy. Everyone knew their place. In the North, because the law made everyone theoretically equal, the white population, he observed, had to enforce the separation socially with even more ferocity to maintain their dominance. He said, "Nowhere is prejudice so intolerant as in those states where servitude has never been known."
He believed they were trapped.
Completely trapped. He believed the black population could never fully assimilate because of this deep-seated white prejudice, and he also dismissed the idea of sending everyone back to Africa, the Liberia colonization project, as a logistical fantasy. The black population was growing too fast.
So what did he think would happen?
He feared a race war was almost inevitable.
And what about Native Americans?
Well, he was witnessing the Indian removal period firsthand, the Trail of Tears era. He was horrified by the hypocrisy and the cruelty of it. He criticized the extermination that was happening under the guise of legal treaties.
But he also had this theory about why their fate was sealed.
He viewed it through this tragic lens of civilization versus pride. He believed that the Native Americans were too proud to assimilate. They refused to adopt the ways of the white man because they valued their own freedom and their own culture too much.
Whereas he felt Black people were being actively prevented from assimilating, even if they wanted to.
Exactly. Yeah. He wrote, "The Negro would like to mix with the European and cannot. The Indian might, to some extent, succeed, but he scorns to attempt it." So ultimately, he predicted the extinction of the Native American tribes as independent nations. He saw the juggernaut of American expansion and knew nothing would be allowed to stand in its way.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And it really shows that he wasn't just a cheerleader for democracy. He saw the bodies buried underneath the foundation of the whole project.
He did. But this brings us to the most uncomfortable part of our deep dive. Section 5. The other, Tocqueville. Because while he was criticizing American treatment of Native Americans, when it came to French colonialism, Tocqueville sounds like a very, very different person.
Yeah, this is the Algeria paradox. I think a lot of people who love Tocqueville, they conveniently forget this part or just gloss over it.
It is often glossed over, but we have to confront it. Tocqueville was a major supporter and a key parliamentary voice on the French colonization of Algeria.
So, some context. France had invaded Algeria in 1830, and Tocqueville visited twice, right? In 1841 and 1846.
Yes. And initially, very early in his career, he had this sort of idealistic hope that the French and Arab races could mix, that they could amalgamate. But after visiting, seeing it on the ground, he did a complete 180. He decided assimilation was impossible.
And his conclusion wasn't let's leave, it was let's dominate.
He called for a dual program, domination and colonization. He was critical of the French military government for being chaotic and corrupt in its treatment of French colonists, but he fully supported the total subjugation of the Arab population.
There are some quotes here that are just really hard to reconcile with the author of Democracy in America. He talks about scorched earth tactics.
He does. He wrote in a report to Parliament that burning harvests, emptying silos, and seizing unarmed civilians, women and children, were, and this is his phrase, unfortunate necessities.
Unfortunate necessities? That sounds like a modern military euphemism for a war crime.
He compared it to European siege warfare. He argued that if you are going to wage war, you have to wage it effectively. He wrote, "I have often heard men in France whom I respect, but with whom I do not agree, find it wrong to burn harvests and empty silos. For my part, I think that these are unfortunate necessities."
Why? Why did the man who wrote so beautifully about liberty support this? It feels like a massive, glaring contradiction.
It is, but you have to understand the context of 1840s France. The country felt humiliated. They had lost the Napoleonic Wars. They saw themselves as a second-rate power compared to Great Britain, which was building a global empire.
Right, Britannia rules the waves.
Exactly. And Tocqueville, for all his liberalism, was an aristocrat who believed in grandeur, national greatness. He believed a nation needed a great enterprise to be healthy. If a nation just focuses on making money, those petty pleasures again, he thought it rots from the inside out.
So he saw war and colonization as a kind of vitamin shot for the national soul.
In a way, yes. He thought the struggle of colonization would revitalize the French spirit, which he felt was becoming soft and materialistic. He wrote, "I do not believe that France can think seriously of leaving Algeria." He thought it would be a signal of national decline. For him, Algeria was a project to lift France out of its petty, bourgeois mediocrity.
That is a very dangerous logic.
It is, and it gets worse. He even advocated for formal segregation. He proposed two distinct legal systems, one for the European colonists, with all the rights of Frenchmen, and a separate, much harsher one for the native Arabs. It was a precursor to an apartheid-like structure.
Was there any nuance at all, or did he just want to crush everyone?
There was some nuance. For instance, he opposed the French invasion of Kabylia, the mountainous Berber region. He kind of admired the Kabyles. He saw them as noble savages in the old Rousseau sense. And he did warn, prophetically again, that if France treated the local populations too poorly for too long, colonization would end in a bloodbath.
Which, history spoiler alert, is exactly what happened in the 20th century with the Algerian War of Independence.
Exactly. It was a horrific bloodbath. Tocqueville saw the danger, but he thought the domination was a risk worth taking for the sake of France's glory. It is the great stain on his liberal legacy.
Before we get to the end of his life, we should touch briefly on his travels to England and Ireland, because he went there too, and he had some fascinating observations about aristocracy that are relevant here.
He did. He went to England in 1833 and Ireland in 1835. And he was obsessed with the difference between the French word gentilhomme and the English word gentleman.
I thought they basically meant the same thing.
Not to Tocqueville. And this distinction for him explained why England had been stable while France had been so chaotic. In France, gentilhomme meant noble by birth. You couldn't become one, you had to be born one. It was a closed, rigid caste.
Right. You either have the blood or you don't.
But in England, he saw that the word gentleman could be applied to any well-educated, well-mannered man, regardless of his birth.
So the British aristocracy was more open, more permeable.
Exactly, which is why he thought England avoided a violent, bloody revolution like France's. The elite was more flexible. If you made a fortune in trade and sent your son to the right schools, he could become part of the club. The aristocracy wasn't a closed fortress. It was a club with a very high entry fee, but you could buy your way in.
And Ireland.
Ireland was a horror show for him, a total nightmare. He described it as having all the evils of an aristocracy and none of its advantages.
Ouch.
He saw extreme, grinding poverty right next to the mansions of the Anglo-Irish landlords. "The poor man at his gate," he wrote. But he noticed something really interesting about the Catholic clergy there. In France, the church was traditionally allied with the king and the rich. But in Ireland, because of British oppression, the Catholic priests were the only friends, the only leaders, of the poor Irish population.
So that broke his simple model of religion always being a conservative force.
Right. It showed him that religion could be a force for liberty and for the people, depending on the political context. He wrote about the unbelievable unity between the Irish clergy and the Catholic population.
So let's move to the final act, Section 6, The Politician and the End. Because Tocqueville didn't just write books from his study, he tried to get into the arena. He tried to be a politician. How did that go?
He was respectable, but perhaps too intellectual for the rough and tumble of daily politics. He served in the Chamber of Deputies for years, from 1839 to 1851. But he wasn't a great orator. He had a quiet voice. He was often sick. He was more of a thinker than a leader of men.
But he was there for the big one, the 1848 revolution.
Which he totally foresaw. Just a few months before it happened, he gave a famous speech in the chamber saying, "We are sleeping on a volcano. Can you not feel the wind of revolution in the air?" He told his colleagues that the mores of the common people were changing, that they were losing all respect for their rulers.
And they probably rolled their eyes and ignored him.
They did. And then, of course, the volcano erupted. The revolution happened. The king was overthrown.
And whose side was he on in that chaos?
He sided with the party of order. He was absolutely terrified of the socialists. He feared the mob again. You can see that childhood trauma coming right back to the surface. He supported the military suppression of the June Days Uprising, which was a violent clash between Parisian workers and the new Republican government. He even advocated for the regularization of the state of siege.
That sounds pretty authoritarian for a lover of liberty.
It was. But in his mind, he was prioritizing order, because he believed that without order, there could be no liberty at all. He even became Minister of Foreign Affairs for a brief stint in 1849 under the new Second Republic.
For what, about 5 months?
Yeah, a very short time. It was a chaotic period. But then came the man who would end his political career for good. Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon III.
Tocqueville despised him. He saw him as a charlatan, a wannabe despot who was using the name of his famous uncle to seize power. And when Louis Napoleon staged his coup d'etat in 1851 to make himself emperor, Tocqueville stood in opposition.
And he was arrested.
He was. He gathered with a group of other deputies to resist the coup, to declare it high treason. But they were all rounded up by the military. He was detained at the fortress of Vincennes for a few days and then released. But that was it for him. He quit politics for good. He refused to serve a usurper.
So he goes home to his castle. He literally had a castle, the Château de Tocqueville in Normandy, and he writes one last masterpiece, The Old Regime and the Revolution.
Published in 1856. And it totally changed how history was understood.
What was the big thesis?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like a dry history book, but you're saying it's really a political argument.
It's a masterpiece of political sociology. He asked a simple but brilliant question. Why did the revolution happen in France, of all places, and not somewhere else where the oppression was even worse?
And his answer wasn't the simple because the king was so bad.
No. In fact, he argued the opposite. The revolution happened precisely where things were getting better.
Wait, what? That's the revolution of rising expectations theory.
Yes, he's one of its originators. He pointed out that the French peasantry in the late 18th century was actually better off than the German or Russian peasantry. They owned land. They had more personal freedom.
So why revolt? If things are getting better, why burn it all down?
Because once you have a little bit of freedom, the remaining oppression becomes absolutely unbearable. If you are totally crushed, you can't even imagine a different life. But if you are halfway free, the chains you still wear feel heavier than ever.
That is a psychological insight that explains so many modern movements.
And his other big point was that the revolutionaries, for all their talk of liberty, hated the king, but they loved the king's power. They didn't want to destroy the centralized state. They wanted to take it over. And they ended up making it even stronger and more absolute than the monarchy ever was.
So the path from monarchy to democracy to tyranny was paved by centralization.
Exactly. For him, Napoleon wasn't the opposite of the revolution. He was its logical conclusion. The perfect democratic despot, everyone is equal under one all-powerful ruler.
And sadly, that was his last big intellectual act.
Yes, he had suffered from tuberculosis for a long time. It finally caught up with him. He died on April 16, 1859, in Cannes, on the French Riviera. He was only 53 years old.
We should mention his wife, Mary Motley, before we wrap up his life.
We must. Their relationship is really quite touching. She was English, she was middle class, and she was a Protestant, though she did convert to Catholicism for him.
And his aristocratic French family must have just hated that.
Oh, they did. She wasn't an aristocrat. She wasn't rich. She was too English. But Tocqueville adored her. They were married for 23 years, and he called her his only true friend.
It shows that for all his grand theories about society, he was also a man who valued that deep personal connection.
And they never had any children, which some biographers think perhaps allowed him to focus so intensely on his work, on his intellectual legacy.
So let's bring this all home. What does this all mean? We've looked at the aristocrat, the traveler, the prophet, the colonialist. What's the final picture?
I think we see a man of profound contradictions, a lover of liberty who supported colonial domination, an aristocrat by birth who accepted that democracy was the inevitable future, even if he didn't entirely like the taste of it.
He seems like someone who's desperately trying to build guardrails for a car that was already speeding down the highway.
That is a perfect analogy. He knew he couldn't stop the car democracy, but he wanted to teach us how to drive it so that we didn't crash into the wall of tyranny.
And his warnings. His warnings about the fence around thought and the soft sleep of comfort, they really stick with me. It just feels like he's describing the algorithm-driven, convenience-obsessed world we're living in right now.
It really, really does. He feared that we would willingly trade our freedom for a quiet, comfortable life. He feared we would become those timid animals.
Which brings us to a final thought. We talked about his cure for all this. Associations, meeting people, solving problems together.
Face to face, in the real world.
Let's give the listener a practical takeaway here. What does an association look like in 2026? It's not just a formal nonprofit.
No, not at all. It's any group where you have to actually negotiate and cooperate with other human beings. It could be a pickup basketball league, a community garden, a protest group, a book club, a church choir.
And why is that negotiation part so important?
Because democracy is annoying, and other people are annoying. They have different opinions. They want to do things differently than you do. When you're in a real association, you have to learn to compromise. You have to listen. You have to persuade. You can't just block them or mute them or downvote them.
It's like a gym for your citizenship muscles.
That's a perfect metaphor. If you don't go to the gym, your muscles atrophy. If you don't participate in associations, your citizen muscles atrophy. You forget how to be a free person among other free people.
And then you just want the shepherd, the government, to come in and take care of everything for you.
Exactly.
So here's the final thought. In a world where we are increasingly isolated behind our screens, where so-called social media is actually making us more withdrawn, that individualism he warned about, have we locked the one tool he said could save us from ourselves?
It is the fundamental question of our time. Tocqueville would say that clicking like is not an association. Arguing in a comment section is not an association. You have to get out of the house. You have to engage with the messy, difficult, wonderful reality of other people. That is the only way to keep liberty alive.
A challenge from 1835 to the future? Get out of the house.
Indeed.
Alexis de Tocqueville, the time traveler, thank you for bringing him to life for us today.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you for listening to this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey. We'll see you next time.